Good afternoon. Welcome to the second Bureau of Business Research webinar of the 2019 Fall Series. My name is Mitch Herian. I serve as Project Director here at the BBR. Today's presentation is sponsored by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the Department of Economics, housed within the College of Business at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Today's presentation will be looking at how to use the Thriving Index web interactive tool. As I'll describe in more detail later, the Thriving Index allows Nebraskans to compare their region's performance on a wide range of outcomes relevant to community thriving and vitality. The interactive web tool that I will show today is just one component of the broader study. The Thriving Index was completed through a collaboration between the UNL Bureau of Business Research, the Rural Futures Institute, and the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Many other individuals here at the university and here at the BBR and across the university collaborated on this project. I simply have the privilege of presenting the work that was the result of a collaborative effort between many individuals and organizations. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to point out several features of the webinar. As you can see, I will be using a PowerPoint presentation to present some of the information to you today. I'll also be taking you to the RFI website and another website to show how to actually use the tool. One feature of the webinar is a chat window where you can chat with other participants of the webinar. There's also a question and answer window where you can type in questions that you might have for me today. I look forward to any questions that you might have for me, and you can type in your question at any time. However, I will answer all questions at the end of the webinar after the presentation has been completed. With that, I will begin today's presentation. Here's just a broad outline of what I'll be talking about today. I will briefly describe the Nebraska Thriving Index. I'll discuss a little bit about the methodology, how we selected regions, how we selected variables, computed some things. I will next take you again to the website to show you how to use the interactive web tool. And finally, I will conclude the presentation. The Nebraska Thriving Index, as I mentioned, was developed in partnership between the Bureau of Business Research, the Rural Futures Institute here at the University of Nebraska, and the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Similar barometers have been developed for urban areas of Nebraska. The Omaha Chamber of Commerce sponsors a barometer, and the Lincoln Partnership for Economic Development also has a dashboard, an economic dashboard. What we wanted to do at the Thriving Index is give rural areas of Nebraska access to similar information as the rural areas have here in the state. So the Thriving Index allows regions to measure their performance on a wide range of variables in relation to other regions in Nebraska and regions in other states. The first step in the process of developing the Thriving Index was to figure out what are the appropriate regions here in Nebraska. So what we did is we were looking at county level data, and we wanted to identify the best way in our minds of aggregating that county level data into regional data. So we drew on several sources to identify these regions here in Nebraska. We took information from the Nebraska Department of Labor, some regional information that they've put together in the past, information from the U.S. Economic Development Agency, as well as UNL Extension. Using those resources, we kind of had some initial thoughts on how we are going to group counties into regions here in the state, and many of the regions you'll see later aren't too surprising in terms of how we put those together. But there were a couple of tweaks that we made, and a lot of the tweaks we made were based on input from the experts we had on our team. So the bottom bullet point you can see, we used existing sources, and we drew on the expertise, deep expertise from some of the members of the Thriving Index team to make little tweaks to some of the regions that I'll talk about on the next slide. So probably the most obvious deviation that many of you will see from what we would normally think about a Nebraska region, say Northeast Nebraska, you can see we pulled out some counties from North 81. North 81, it refers to Highway 81, which connects Columbus and Norfolk via 4-lane highway. We pulled out the two micropolitan statistical areas of Norfolk and Columbus and grouped those together so we could check their performance, allow them to compare their performance as a cohesive block. So the Norfolk Micropolitan Statistical Area includes Madison, Pierce, and Stanton counties. The Columbus Micropolitan Statistical Area includes Platte County. Northeast Nebraska, you can see those 4 counties have been pulled out of that region, as have 2 others, Dakota and Dixon County, which are in the bottom left of the slide, are named Siouxland County. Those 2 counties are actually part of the Sioux City Metropolitan Statistical Area, so we chose to look at those 2 separately as well. The Panhandle region probably looks very familiar to most folks. I think on some other maps you'll see some of those counties along the eastern edge of that region are sometimes included. The Sandhills region includes north central Nebraska, the counties in north central Nebraska. Maybe a little deviation here as Custer County was included with the Sandhills. Maybe Custer County's not in some of the other regional maps that you might see. Southeast Nebraska, again, it obviously includes the southeastern counties in Nebraska. The main difference here is we pulled out those urban counties. So Lancaster and Seward County of the Lincoln Metropolitan Statistical Area, and then Douglas, Sarpy, Cass, and Saunders from the Omaha Metropolitan Statistical Area. Southwestern Nebraska includes McCook and North Platte, and the Tri-Cities region includes Grand Island, Hastings, and Kearney, and some of the counties that exist south of those 3 metropolitan and micropolitan areas that we felt are connected to those 3 communities. So once we identified the Nebraska regions that we were interested in, that we wanted to develop comparisons for, the next step was to find the appropriate regions outside of Nebraska to compare Nebraska regions to. So we really just looked at neighboring states as well as some other states in the upper Midwest and in Illinois. So you can see we looked at Colorado, really just focused on the eastern edge of Colorado, the western edge of Illinois, all of Iowa, all of Kansas, all of Minnesota, all of Missouri, eastern Montana, all of North Dakota, all of South Dakota, and eastern Wyoming. And what we did for these states, we did not try to do anything unique with these regions in terms of rolling up counties to regions that we think make sense. Instead, we just relied upon existing EDA regions to make our comparisons there. So how did we identify which regions outside of Nebraska to compare Nebraska regions to? We use a technique called Mahalanobis matching to identify appropriate regions. So rather than just sort of use an ad hoc approach or kind of by the gut approach to identifying regions outside Nebraska that we think match up with regions here in Nebraska, we wanted to take a more systematic approach. So we use this matching technique. We looked at 7 different variables, 7 different characteristics of all these regions in Nebraska and the EDA regions outside Nebraska. So in total, I believe there were 85 different regions that we looked at. The 7 variables we looked at across those 85 regions were population, the percent of the population in a micropolitan area, the percent of farm and ranch income as a percentage of total income, the percent of people employed in manufacturing, and the distance from a large metropolitan area and distance from a small metropolitan area. And again, we took those 7 variables, we put those into a formula that essentially gave us the distance between our Nebraska regions and the distance away mathematically, so to speak, for other regions outside Nebraska. And I should say, it's just not outside Nebraska, as you'll see later. Some Nebraska regions will compare those to other Nebraska regions. It just so happened that some Nebraska regions were statistically similar to one another, so the distance wasn't very far between those. So we'll compare those to one another for comparison's sake. Once we identified our Nebraska regions and comparison regions, next was the next task was to identify all the different variables that we wanted to include. So in total, we have 8 indexes. There's 3 of those you'll see here. These 3 indexes measure economic prosperity. There's 5 more on the next slide that I'll show you in just a moment. What I would like to point out before I discuss this slide and the next slide is that these 3 indices, as well as the 5 indices on the next page, we average those together to come up with an overall Thriving Index score that you'll see later on when I demonstrate the web tool. So I just wanted to point that out before we talk about these sub-indices here. So what you see here on the slide, again, these are measures of economic prosperity. So we have the Growth Index, the Economic Opportunity and Diversity Index, and Other Prosperity Index. Below, you can see the different variables that were included. Just to give you an idea of what these economic prosperity measures are designed to do, the Growth Index includes multiple measures of growth, primarily over the 2014 to 2017 period, so measuring change over that time on the variables that you see. So it's really just looking at sort of a longitudinal measure of how our regions have changed on the 5 variables that you see on the screen. Economic Opportunity and Diversity measures entrepreneurial activity, industry diversity, occupation diversity, and share of telecommuters. Other Prosperity Index includes measures of non-farm personal income, total personal income stability, lifespan, percent in poverty, and share of income from dividends, interest, and rent. Again, there are 5 other indices. These 5 are designed to measure economic conditions in the state. So we have demographic growth and renewal. You can see the 6 variables that are included in that index. I should point out also at this time that to compute something like the demographic growth and renewal index, the 6 variables that you see listed underneath that title, those are averaged to give you a score on that demographic growth and renewal index. And that's the same for all 8 of these indices that you see here. We have the Education and Skill Index. You can see the 4 variables that go into that index. Infrastructure and Cost of Doing Business Index, there are 6 variables that you can see. Quality of Life Index, there are 10 variables that comprise this index. And the Social Capital Index, there are 5 variables that go into this index. So once all the data were collected, we collected raw data from various sources, the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, private sources. Once we had all that collected, we needed to aggregate the data to develop an index score. So rather than just present folks with the raw data itself, some sort of mean that might not make a lot of sense to folks, we indexed everything at 100. So we took all the raw data, indexed everything to 100, so that it's a little more interpretable for all audiences. So what you'll see when I demonstrate the web tool is that 100 represents the mean score on a metric. Values above 100 are above the mean. Values below 100 are below the mean. So if your region has a score of 125, what that would mean is that you're obviously above the mean, but it would mean that you're 25% or 0.25 of a standard deviation above the mean. I won't get into too much detail on that, but that's how the numbers were computed. Again, as I pointed out earlier, the Thriving Index is the average of the 8 other indices presented on the previous 2 slides. So when I move to the web tool here in a moment, the first thing you'll see is the score of North 81 on the Thriving Index compared to its comparison regions. That will, again, represent the average of the 8 other indices that I just covered. I will now transition to the RFI website, the Rural Futures Institute website, to show you some of the resources on that page, as well as to demonstrate how to use the interactive web tool. So we will refresh that page. So you can access the Nebraska Thriving Index through the Rural Futures Institute website. So if you go to ruralfutures.nebraska.edu, click on Index, it'll take you to this page. You may need to wait a couple of moments for the tool that you see here to load. Sometimes it times out just for a second. You hit reload and it will pop back up and refresh. But at the top of the page, you can see the interactive web tool that I'll demonstrate here in a moment. But there are many other resources here on this page that you can view if you would like. So here's a little bit more information about the Thriving Index. Here is a link to download the entire report that was recently came out. Here's information about recent and upcoming presentations that have been made related to the Thriving Index. A little bit more information about the regions that I discussed a moment ago. And there's actually a link to a technical report that gives you more technical, detailed information about how the comparison regions were identified, and sort of the information that went into developing that. For today's demonstration, I will actually go to another website that has this tool as its own web page. I'm simply going to do that so we can see it a little better on the screen. And I will go to that tab right now. Again, you may need to reload when you visit the interactive web tool. Again, what you can see here is a graph and several drop downs and tabs over here on the left-hand side. So we have two things here in the top left. We have two tabs, charts. This is what we're viewing right now. We have a tab for maps. If you want to see this same information presented geographically, you can click on maps and it takes you to a map that shows essentially that same graph, just on a map that you can, as you just saw, you can zoom in, zoom out, get detail about which towns are in which counties, that sort of information. Below those two tabs, we have a drop down where you can select which Nebraska region you are interested in. In this case, the default is North 81, simply because North 81 is first in line alphabetically among the Nebraska regions that we're interested in. Next, you can select which index you are interested in. Right now, the default is the Thriving Index, so we wanted to give people that overall score right when they begin to view this page, work with this interactive tool. And as I'll show later, once I select some of the sub-indices, this third drop-down box will populate with the metrics that are used to compute that sub-index. So we'll go back to charts here for North 81. So this is just a bar graph. You can see as I hover over each of these bars, the actual score, the actual value in this case, the Thriving Index is presented. So North 81 has a value of 144. As you can see, it is first among its peers. Next highest score is 129, the 117, and so on. Again, if you go to the map, you can see the same information essentially is presented. So here's North 81, Thriving Index 144. Next highest, Mid-Minnesota Development Commission, 129, and so on. So looking at some more Nebraska regions, we'll just step through all the Nebraska regions, see how all 8 regions are doing on the Thriving Index. So next is Northeast Nebraska. So Northeast Nebraska has 5 other regions it's being compared to. You can see the Northeast regions being compared to 2 other Nebraska regions, the Panhandle and the Southwest Nebraska. So Northeast Nebraska is sitting 3rd among its peers with a score of 103. The Panhandle region has 6 comparison regions. Again, it's being compared to Northeast, Southwest. There's also Tricities here. So the Panhandle is being compared to 3 other regions in Nebraska, as well as 1 in Wyoming, 1 in Colorado, and 1 in Iowa. You can see the Panhandle is sitting 3rd among its peers with a score of 98. Again, recall that 100 is average, signified by this green line. So the Panhandle region is just below average for its peers. Looking at the Sandhills has 5 comparison regions. The Sandhills is sitting 2nd among its peers with a score of 109. Just a quick view of who the Sandhills is being compared to. So the Sandhills is being compared to 1, 2, 3 other regions in Nebraska, 1 in Iowa, and 1 in Kansas. The Siouxland region, again, this is the Dixon and Dakota counties here in Nebraska. There are 5 comparison regions. Siouxland is sitting 3rd with a score of 105. So it's above the mean, sitting 3rd among its peers. You can see spatially who the Siouxland region is being compared to. So regions in Illinois, Iowa, 3 in Iowa, and northwest Minnesota. The Southeast region is being compared to 8 other comparison regions. This is the Southeast region for whatever reason, based on our matching scores, identified 8 other regions as potentially good matches. So we included all 8 in this case. Southeast Nebraska has more comparison regions than the rest of the regions that we've looked at. But you can see the Southeast region is sitting 3rd among its peers with a score of 112. And the map gives you an idea of where all these regions are located. A couple in Minnesota, South Dakota, and several here in Iowa. Southwest region has 6 comparison regions, and it is sitting 5th among its peers with a score of 95. And you can see who the Southwest region is being compared to here on this map. Finally, we will take a look at the Tricities region. The Tricities region is sitting 1st among its peers, so 6 other comparison regions with a score of 136. So the Tri-Cities area in North 81 are both doing pretty well in terms of sitting 1st among their peers on the Thriving Index. Okay, as I mentioned, the Thriving Index is an average of all 8 other indices that we are considering in this report. So, even though North 81 and Tri-Cities are sitting 1st on the Thriving Index, that doesn't necessarily mean they're sitting 1st on all of the variables that we've considered in this report. So if we want to dig a little deeper, and I'll just go back to North 81 for simplicity's sake here. If we want to drill down and look at some of the other sub-indices that we've talked about, we can do that, again, by going to the second drop down. And let's, for example, just go to Demographic Growth and Renewal Index. As I mentioned, when you select an index in this second box, this third one populates with all the different variables that are included in that index. The first thing you'll see is this average score. for the demographic growth and renewal index. So that's the default when you select one of the indexes. So here, North 81 has a value of 122 on demographic growth and renewal. That's second among its peers, above the mean. So that gives you the overall index score. If you are interested in other variables, for example, the dependency ratio, you click on that, and that gives you that sub-index score. So the dependency ratio, that's a share of the population below the age of 18 and over the age of 65. You can actually see down here, this text box gives you a brief description of what that variable means and its significance for the RFI Thriving Index. But you can see North 81, it's doing well in the Thriving Index, it's doing well on the demographic growth and renewal index, but when you look at the dependency ratio variable, it's sitting way below the average for among its comparison regions with a score of 54, which is fourth among its peers. We can keep going, look at median age. Again, the description of that variable and its significance is included in the text box there. For North 81, on this particular variable, you can see it has a score of 181, which is second among its peers. We could continue to go through the various indexes and the sub-indices to continue to explore the tool. However, you all have access to this website, to the RFI website. Again, I encourage you to go to the RFI Nebraska Thriving Index website, explore this tool and all the other resources that are available here, and look at how your regions are doing compared to other Nebraska regions and other regions outside Nebraska. In that, will conclude my demonstration of the interactive web tool for today. So we are currently in the process of or continuing work on the Thriving Index. So we're currently in the process of collecting data from 2019 to develop a report that will be put together, be ready for release in spring of 2020. 2019 data are currently being processed by the government. Those will be available sometime later this fall or winter. And that information will be generated to put together a May 2020 report. The BBR will continue to make enhancements to the interactive web tool that I demonstrated. There's several things we're going to do in terms of computations and improving just the visuals of that tool. So in conclusion, the Nebraska Thriving Index, we hope, will help identify areas of economic strength in Nebraska's regions and areas where Nebraska regions lag. We hope, again, that the Thriving Index will allow community and state leaders to develop future-focused strategies to build on regional advantages and address areas of concern. If you go to the RFI Thriving Index webpage, there is a place for feedback, or my contact information is available later on. If you want to provide any feedback on the tool, including which variables that we might include in the future, we've done a couple of presentations throughout the state where folks have recommended variables for us to include. If you have any feedback on regional comparisons, so hey, we think our region should be compared to this place and this state because that's who we've historically compared ourselves to. We'd love to hear that information, as well as information on how to best present the data. We hope to make this as usable as possible for as many different audiences as possible. So if you have any feedback, any input on how to best push information out to folks, we'd be happy to hear that as well. And before I take questions, I would just like to recognize all the folks that contributed to this project. So you can see the principal investigator is Dr. Eric Thompson here at the Bureau of Business Research. Dr. Bree Doherty at UNK was the co-PI, and you can see the rest of us listed there. You know, everybody is very instrumental in helping, not just methodologically, but also in terms of getting the report put together, getting it finalized, getting the website put together, and all that work. So I'd just like to recognize everybody that was involved in the project from the beginning. And finally, I'm ready for any questions that you all might have. Okay, so the first question is, could you please tell me more on what to read from the charts and what would be some policy implications for the regional developments? So I think our hope is, in the future that we will have longitudinal data. So currently what we have now is information. It's not all cross-sectional data. As I mentioned, the growth index does look at change from 2014 to 2017. But most of the other variables we saw, they're cross-sectional data. What that means is they're collected at a point in time, either in 2017 or 2018. So it's kind of a snapshot of what's going on at that moment. As we continue this project and collect data over time, we can begin to see changes on various things. So what that will allow us to do in terms of measuring change over time, it may allow us to see where policy interventions may have changed the trajectory of a variable. So in terms of policy implications, I think that's where we would like to focus in the future. Right now, I'm not sure that we would be able to say a whole lot about policy implications right now, but in the future, as we look at things longitudinally, we may be able to help measure the impact of policy implementations at the regional level. The question is, did we include variables relating to the tax and administrative structures of the regions? No, we did not include that. There was a little bit of discussion about that, but we did not include those variables. While we are waiting for other questions, I will present the BBR future schedule of the BBR webinar series. The next webinar is scheduled for November 8th, and we'll cover the economic impact of craft breweries here in the state. The BBR recently did a study looking at the economic impact of craft breweries as well as the impact on quality of life here in Nebraska. I think there's another one I couldn't see. So a question is, it's clear the index value of 100 represents the average, but I was curious what that was, the average of all counties in the U.S. or only those regions being computed. So those are only the regions being computed. So when you see the 100 line, our regions are, for North 81, again, to use as a comparison, North 81 compared to 5 other regions. That 100 line is the average of just those 5 comparison regions, or those 6, the North 81 and the other 5 comparison regions. Could you talk more about the ranking system of each individual factors under the overarching categories? So we really didn't rank anything the rankings I showed you were just sort of informal rankings as the numbers shake out. So I guess to give you an idea of how things were computed, so we collected raw data at the county level. Again, we aggregated that up to the region level. We weighted those scores by population. I did not talk about that at all in this presentation, but those are weighted averages. So for each region, we got a ultimate score on, again, something like median age. So each region has a score. Once we compare our Nebraska region to those other 5 regions, again, those things there's some weighting going on there. But at the end of the day, you get a score of, for North 81 on median age, which was 54. It just happened to be 4th among its peers. So that was really the only ranking that took place, was at the very end after all of our computations had been made. By not including tax and administrative variables, you're not missing policy implications. I think that is something that we could include in the future. I mean, I absolutely agree that if we looked at tax policy at a regional level or state level, we could measure the impact of those tax policies. But again, because our variables are computed or measured as cross-sectionally at a point in time, the best we would be able to do is run some sort of correlation between tax policy and the variable in question. So we would not really be able to see the impact of that tax policy over time at this point. So again, if we collect data for 4 or 5 years, and year 1, year 2, a region or state or locality, whatever it might be, adopts a policy, we continue to collect data 3, 4, and 5 years, we could potentially see the impact of that tax policy within that time frame. But with the data we've collected at this point, to this point in time, we wouldn't be able to do a whole lot in terms of looking at how that tax policy has impacted anything that we've included in the index. Do you know which, if any, of the comparison regions have regional planning councils and or work on regional economic development strategies? I think they all do. Outside of Nebraska, all of the regions that we included are EDA regions. So those, every single one of those, if you went to the Thriving Index web tool or downloaded the report and you saw the regions that we included in other states, the one that comes to mind is like Area 15 in Iowa. That one, there was a comparison region for a bunch of our Nebraska regions for whatever reason. But for example, if you went to Area 15 in Iowa, looked at their website, you would see, yes, they are a regional economic development organization. So you can see which counties are involved. You can see, so for all those organizations that you see, all those regions that you saw us Nebraska regions compared to, you could easily go find out what they are doing in other states and learn more about them. As I mentioned, we are happy to, I'm happy to take any more questions if anybody has those. It doesn't look like any more have come quite yet. But as I mentioned, we are happy to take any feedback that you all might have on the project, be it variables, regions, or presentation strategies. If you'd just like to learn more about the project, here's my contact information. Again, you can go to the RFI website, and there are places for you to provide input there. But if you want to contact me, I'd be more than happy to take any questions or comments that you all might have. And here is information for the Bureau of Business Research. So you can connect with the BBR in several different ways through LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and you can visit our website. If you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, where we include information about such things as the RFI Thriving Index, feel free to send your preferred email address to bbr@unl.edu. To this point, there have been no more questions, so I would like to thank everyone for attending the. I'm sorry, I just thought a question came through. I'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar. Thank you for your interest in the RFI Thriving Index web report and webpage. As I mentioned, it's been a lot of work by a lot of different people here in the state, and we're very proud of it. And again, we'd love to hear any feedback you might have in the future, and please look forward to more information about the Thriving Index in the future as we make enhancements to the website and release a later report. So again, thank you very much for your attention today, and have a good weekend.